Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out today to the HNA Palisades Conference Center. My name is Maria Gagliardi, and I'm the director of the Palisades Free Library. And it is my pleasure to say that this is our 11th year of running the Palisades People Sunday Symposium. So this was an idea that was started by the trustees in 2006, and we've held at least one, usually 2 or 3 a year, since that time. So I think we'll get started with our program, but first I would like to introduce Nick Luddington, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
In 1986, I was sent back for the second time to run the Middle East Bureau for the Associated Press. And as I know you can imagine, that...
Put the mic up, please.
Is that better? Yeah, okay. The Middle East is the newsiest bureau of the AP, and so it's a big responsibility. One of which came up was to be covering the first Iraq War. Another responsibility I had was to do what I could to help free and even find Terry Anderson, the Beirut correspondent of AP, who'd been kidnapped 2 years before. That particular challenge ended up having a wonderful upside, because when we got to Cyprus, which is where the Middle East Bureau was for the AP at the time, we met Madeleine, Terry's wife, who incidentally has just become a Palisadian and has bought a house, so she's a near neighbor of the Palisades Library. And I met Sulome. Sulome was captivating. She was cute, intelligent, great sense of humor, and I was completely taken by her. I have 2 fine sons and no daughters, so it made it very close. And Sulome did me a great favor. She made it impossible for me to use my important sounding position to throw my weight around in any way possible. One day we were playing on the floor, and Madeleine and Cass were watching, and Sulome made a sassy remark, and I said, "Oh, you're a silly Billy." And she looked at me and said, "And you are a silly turtle." Well, this became a nice family joke, but it also spread like the plague through the journalistic community. And you can imagine how grand I felt when I walked into the AP office, rather large office, and the youngest correspondent greets me by saying, "Morning, Turtle." Even worse, when an important confidential Arab source opened a telephone conversation with me by saying, "Am I speaking to the silly turtle?" So, humbled, I went on my way, and Sulome went on hers, and she became a wonderful writer and reporter, and she has done this excellent book. The book is a fine combination of memoir, cleverly capsulated Middle East history, and a thriller-like account of trying to find one of her father's kidnappers. And I'm going to leave the book to her. So over to you, silly Billy.
I'm not sure if one of these mics works. I'm a little short for this podium. Let's see. Well, it's on? Hello? Oh, perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you to the silly turtle. So, yeah, this is great. It's really nice to be back here. I lived here briefly when I was probably from 12 to 14, so a couple of years. And we went to the Palisades church, so this place has a really, a special place in my heart. And it's really nice to see everyone. Okay, so I'll just dive right in. This book took 3 years for me to write. And it started out, I guess the idea behind it was I had moved, well, let me start from the beginning. I didn't want to be a journalist for a really long time. People used to ask me when I was little, because both my parents worked in that world, obviously, and people used to ask me, do you want to be a reporter? And I'd say, I don't think so. Not only because of what happened to my father, but because it's a job that really takes a toll on the people who do it, especially war journalism and conflict reporting. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit because I think it's really important in this day and age to discuss journalism and the state of it and how much it is needed and what we need to do to save it. But I'll get to that. So I decided to become a journalist. Well, it sort of just pulled me in. One day I woke up and realized, I had been around this my whole life. It was pretty much all I knew growing up, and I loved it. And there was no fighting it anymore. So I gave in and I went to Columbia Journalism School. And then when I was, in 2011, when I completed my master's, I moved to Lebanon and started reporting there, which, seems odd, like an odd choice, because it is. That was where my father was kidnapped and spent, almost 7 years in captivity. And, I'm sure there are lots of psychological reasons I did that, but, that's for another time. And I started reporting on, completely unrelated things. I wasn't ready to go there into my past or anything like that. So I reported on conflict. I tried to stay away for a long time from actual war reporting because, again, I grew up around people who had been quite traumatized by their jobs and by the things that they saw. And I was very careful about how far into that world I would venture at first because, most people who do this job, I think, I have a strange reaction to fear. So it wasn't fear of the situation itself. It was more fear of what I would see and how it would affect me, to see those kind of things. So anyway, so I started doing, venturing closer and closer and closer to that world without ever really entering it until recently. But I would come upon these threads of my family's story as I was reporting. As chance would have it, I ended up reporting on Hezbollah quite a bit, and I still do. Lebanon is a very strange place. All the scars of the Civil War are very evident, still. And the people who were involved in my father's kidnapping are still very much alive and very much present in certain parts of Lebanon. And, I would be doing a story on something unrelated, and someone would tell me, I know that house, your father was held in that house right there. Or one of your father's kidnappers lives right over there. So I couldn't really escape it. And then I decided that I was in a place where I could actually address it and go back and not only explore how it impacted my life, but also explore the event itself. As a reporter, I wanted to find out what happened. From a distance, with a reporter's eye, I didn't think I could write about it without that distance. So I did. So I started reporting on it. Took 3 years to write, and throughout my process, my original aim from the beginning was to meet and interview one of the men who kidnapped my father. And there was a point where I didn't think it was going to happen because I would come close and I would ask people, do you think they'll talk to me? Absolutely not. No way. These people are still in hiding. There's still, actually money on their heads. So I thought it was just, it was a lost cause. I didn't think it was going to happen. And then by chance, and I won't go into the details of this because it's all in the book, by chance I ended up meeting one of them, completely coincidentally. I was interviewing him for another story, and then through a long, complicated series of circumstances, he found out who I was, and I found out who he was eventually. We developed a very strange relationship. it was complicated. It was really intense. I had known him for a while before I knew who he was, so I had already formed an opinion of him, and he had already formed an opinion of me before either one of us knew who the other one was, or our connection to each other. So my experience interviewing him gave me so much insight into the world of terrorism, into how somebody becomes a terrorist. Because I'm a strong believer that terrorism is avoidable, and you know, while there are people who are pathological and they will always be criminals or terrorists or you know, evil men, there are lots of things that are done, you know, policies, particularly our policies in the Middle East, that create situations in which these men can get a foothold and exploit and manipulate people who are impressionable, poor, desperate. And I think that, you know, by speaking to him, what was very confusing for me throughout the whole process, something I had to come to terms with, is because I knew him for a long time before I knew who he was, I also knew that he wasn't an evil man. And that was very difficult for me to wrap my mind around, and it took me a long time to come to terms with that, because he did evil things, but there are people who wouldn't be terrorists in other circumstances, who are, and it's not about making excuses for them. It's not, I mean, everybody has choices. People do things because, you know, they choose to. But at the same time, there are, as Americans, we really have to spend time exploring the role that we play in creating situations in which these types of people become radicalized. And I think, you know, this experience gave me a lot of insight into that whole dynamic that was really valuable. So I'm going to do a little reading from this. In fact, I'm going to sit down first. And I'm going to read a couple of sections. The first one is an interview I did with, I don't know if anybody's heard of Robert Fisk, but he's what you would call the quintessential war journalist. He's been doing it for a long, long time, maybe too long. And he wrote a very fantastic book about Lebanon, and he's quite famous. And he's somebody that I respect very much as a journalist. And I also have seen the toll that this job has taken on him. And I think the reason I'm going to read this passage first is because it captured, my interview with him really captured the price that we pay when we see violence and write about it and report on it and constantly consume it as a career. So I'm going to do that first. I can't stop thinking about those people, the women and children cut down like animals, like little snakes. But if I shudder at the thought, how must it be for Robert Fisk, who keeps watching the dead pile up, unable to stop working, to retire and tear his eyes from the Middle East as it burns itself to dust? Can I ask you a personal question, Robert? I say. Go ahead, Fisk replies, but a wary look crosses his face. Do you still see those people when you close your eyes at night? The ones from Sabra and Shatila? No, not at all, he says quickly, firmly. The only thing that happened was one night after I'd written the big story. I thought the corpses were lying around me on the bed. The reason was that my clothes stank of dead people, and we were so tired during the Israeli invasion and siege, absolutely exhausted, that I had strange dreams. I had a dream at one point. I'd been in so many air raids that through the window of my bedroom, a little tiny Israeli plane came. I could see the pilot, and he whizzed out of the other window. He gives a short, bright burst of laughter. That's what happens when you're very tired. But you must know about PTSD, I argue. You're saying all of it never affected you? No, not at all, he repeats. However terrible the things I've seen, I can come home to Beirut, go to a French restaurant, and forget about it. You have to be tough to work in the Middle East, and if you're affected by it very badly, go home. But the toughest people I know in this job, they see ghosts at night, most of them. I persist. I don't see ghosts, Fisk insists. I never see ghosts. Never seen a ghost in my life. Well, not ghosts, but my friend is a tough guy. He's seen some bad shit. And he freely admits, and I've heard him because I've slept on his couch, that he has terrible nightmares. Well, I've never done that, Fisk says uncomfortably. No, I've been fine. I think you can turn the recorder off now. Wait, I respond quickly. I grew up with journalists, Robert, and I never deluded myself that anything I wrote would make a difference. For me, it was never about changing things. I don't think we do change very much, sorry to say. Fisk interjects shortly. I can see I'm losing him. It must bother you, though, seeing all this and writing about it. No, it doesn't. And never seeing anything change, I finish. Did you ever feel as though you detached? No, he says again with finality. I feel very sorry for dead people. But when you're around a lot of dead people, you're quite frightened, not because it reminds you that we're all going to die, but because you know the killers aren't far away and they're not going to care about your life, especially with the indignity at Sabra and Shatila. With the heat of the summer, the bodies were corrupting very quickly. Within 2 days, they were leaking chemicals all over the road, and the stench was indescribable. I remember I did a film interview with Irish television, and I kept having to swipe the flies off my face because they were going from the bodies to me. When I got back to Dublin, they told me they could see me swiping at my face, but they couldn't see the flies on TV. The immigration officer said, "Oh, we know you, Bob. You're the fella that keeps slapping yourself around the face." Fisk barks another quick, loud laugh like a gunshot. I think I now regard the dead as friends who would want me to tell what happened to them. And if the soul exists, if they're moving around, they'll see me and say, "That's Bob Fisk. He'll tell the world what happened to us." But that's not post-traumatic stress. That's just my view on it. Now please turn off the recorder. I turn it off, but I can't turn off the way his face closed like a shutter being snapped when I asked him if he saw ghosts. It's the same look my father gets when anything comes close to the wounds at his core, the ones I watched him drown in food, wine, and money, ignoring them with every fiber of his being. Because you can't be around the dead that much without seeing ghosts. I watched them flit across Robert Fisk's eyes myself. Whether he admits it or not, he's haunted by them, just as my father is. I imagine their whispers can become quite loud in the dark and quiet. I think they must weigh on a person, heavy as the rocks and crags of the Lebanese coast. And I'm just going to read another little snippet. This is from my when I basically right after I found out who this my father's kidnapper was and his involvement in my dad's in his captivity. So this chapter is titled "The Integration," and the quote I used was, "No human being, when you understand his desires, is worthless. No one's life is nothing. Even the most evil of men and women, if you understand their hearts, had some generous act that redeems them, at least a little, from their sins." Orson Scott Card. The afternoon of May 28, 2015 is dragging its feet. It's the very last day of my third trip to Lebanon in 5 months. I have a flight to catch at 8 the next morning. All my efforts to persuade the Mas'ul to finally set a date for this interview have proven fruitless. Desperate, I call my fixer and ask him what we should do. "Fuck it," he says colorfully. By now, the poor man has spent an extraordinary amount of time trying to get the Mas'ul to sit down with me. In many ways, it's become his quest as well as mine, although he too has asked me not to include any identifying information about him because he wants to avoid the headache Hezbollah would give him for bringing me around these people. Let's just go. He can't ignore us if we're outside his house. So we jump in the car, drive to Jnub, and call the Mas'ul when we're 5 minutes away. Arab hospitality being the revered institution it still is in those parts, he can't really say no. When we arrive, he welcomes us in, and we sit down in his living room as he serves us coffee and presses a cigarette on me. I light it and feel the smoke curl around my face. The Mas'ul and I look at each other. The moment is like a foundation stone finally shifting into place. It feels as inevitable as a mountain avalanche in winter. Before we got there, my fixer told me to act as though I didn't know the man the Mas'ul had spoken about was actually him. But the pretense is immediately dropped by us both. The Mas'ul must understand that I know who he is by the set of my shoulders when I walk into his house, the confusion in my eyes. He spreads his hands almost helplessly. "You should be interviewing the American soldiers on the New Jersey who killed our people after they lied and said they were neutral, then took the Israeli side," he tells me as I jot down his words in my notebook. He's referring to an incident in which the U.S. battleship fired upon Druze and Shia militias in the hills overlooking Beirut. For some reason supposedly having to do with bad gunpowder, the ship's fire was disastrously inaccurate, some shells missing their targets by 10,000 yards. When the dust settled, hundreds of civilians in the Shia suburbs of Beirut lay dead. Many cite the USS New Jersey incident as a pivotal moment in the Lebanese Civil War, after which the neutrality of the U.S. force in Lebanon came under serious question, and Lebanese Muslims began to believe the United States had chosen the side of the Christians and their Israeli sponsors. "Do you know why we kidnapped your father?" the Mas'ul asked me. "It was nothing personal. Our fight was not with Terry Anderson or the other hostages. Our fight was with the people who had slaughtered our families." "But you ruined my family," I tell him. The Mas'ul holds my pain up to the light and examines it. I can tell it hurts him to look at. He sighs. "When we took your father, we weren't thinking about you," he replies. "You're sitting here in front of me now. You're a decent, good, respectable girl. I like you very much. And I liked your father. He is a good man, the best out of all those we took. But it could have been anyone. If someone else had caught our eye, we would have taken him. I look at you now and I feel for you. I think about your father and I feel for him too. But at the time, we didn't see your father as Terry Anderson, the person. To us, he was America." So, thanks. So yes, that was, I won't get into the whole experience, but as you can imagine, it was very complicated and confusing. What was also difficult for me, obviously, is when you write something that's also part memoir, because something I also explored in this book is the effect my father's kidnapping had on me, our relationship, how difficult it was for many, many years. And you know, it's always hard to write about people in your life who you love, because you know, I was very nervous about my father reading it, for example. You know, I would say I was pretty honest in the book, and in ways that I was worried would hurt him. And it's funny because I recently looked at a first draft that I wrote, and it was much angrier than the final product. As I went through this process, I really, you know, as cliche as it is to say it was cathartic and healing and all that, it definitely was. It transformed our relationship, and it transformed the way I think of both of my parents. And you know, when you report on your family, when you report on your parents, you get a little distance from your own emotional, you know, involvement, and you really see them objectively or more objectively, and see how difficult their situation was, how hard they tried, and it was a really beautiful thing that brought us together. But it's difficult, you know, writing about every horrible thing that's ever happened to you, every emotional scar. You know, it's not easy, but I'm really glad I did it. And then I guess I'll just talk a little bit about something that I'm kind of on a crusade about right now, which is journalism. This is a book about journalism. Journalism shaped my life. It saved my life in many ways, and it's in a really dire state right now, and I try to tell everybody I can exactly how dire the situation is for journalists, especially foreign journalists in conflict situations. You know, in my father's time, there were protections for journalists. There was compensation was adequate and generous in many ways. Because the people who risk their lives and do the most work should probably be paid for it. And that has completely changed with the advent of the internet. You know, staff, there's hardly any staff positions. The staff positions are, you know, overseas. Foreign bureaus have been closing left and right. I'm a freelancer, and I can tell you that, you know, my friends who have staff positions are overworked, underpaid. Freelancers are treated exploitatively, I would say, by news industries at this point. It's not a popular opinion, but it's the absolute truth. So what happens, you know, we're in a state right now where there are no protections for freelance journalists at all. No security. A lot of news organizations won't even commit to a story before you go into the situation and report it, because they don't want the liability. But once you're out, they'll consider the piece. So and because of, you know, internet advertising and a lot of reasons that I won't get into, there's not enough money. And the people who are taking the biggest hit are the people who are risking their lives. And when you are getting paid, you know, $300 for, let's say, a 2,000-word story in which you're reporting from a conflict zone, you can't afford a fixer, which is very, very important. Fixers are or you can't afford a good fixer. And they're the ones who, pretty much hold your life in their hands in many ways. They coordinate, they translate, they have the contacts, and they take you in. Their job is to take you in and out of dangerous situations and keep you safe. And when you're not getting paid enough to afford a good one, then you cut corners, you take risks. James Foley cut corners and took risks, and we all know what happened there. So, all I would say is I really try to raise awareness as much as possible, because our society is crippled without free and robust press. And, especially right now, like, for example, I am having so much trouble selling stories that don't involve Donald Trump. It's quite challenging, very challenging. And I think, as Americans, we become very, we're in this feedback loop where, we don't really have much of an awareness as a culture. I mean, everybody's different, and there are obviously many exceptions to this, but as a culture, we tend to be very focused inward. We don't really pay attention necessarily to what's going on in the outside world, and because there are very few people reporting on it, very few people can afford to make a living doing this job anymore, and the stories just aren't getting reported, and the ones that aren't paid attention to. So I just encourage everybody here to read foreign news, to concern themselves with things that are happening in faraway places and people that are nothing like you, and have live lives that seem completely alien, but at the same time, as a journalist, who's spoken to lots of people in lots of different circumstances and life positions, I can tell you that people are pretty much people wherever you go. And those people in faraway places that you think are nothing like you are actually much, much more similar than you would imagine. They have the same hopes, dreams, aspirations, and many of them are existing in circumstances that are almost impossible for us to comprehend in our lives. So it's really, really important to value journalism, to consume it, and to support it in any way possible, especially right now. So that's I'm getting on my soapbox a little bit, but I'm trying to think what else I want to talk about. I guess I'm probably just going to leave it open to questions, because I feel like there's, it's better to have a conversation if anybody's interested in asking anything. So I'll just turn it over to you guys. Sure.
How old were you when your father was released, and where were you?
I was 6.5, and we had some false alarms before where we thought he was going to be released, and he wasn't. We had points where we thought he was no longer among us, and so I think my mom I think they'd known for a little bit, but she didn't want to get my hopes up or anything. And then it was confirmed, I guess, that he had been released. And I remember I was asleep. It was the middle of the night. My mother woke me up, and she said, "Your father's been released." And we flew on a plane. I remember like an army plane, and I got sick. and then we went to the American Embassy in Damascus, which is where he was, the big reception was, and he had been taken there. And it's probably one of my earliest, most clear memories. I fell asleep again, and he woke me up, and he just said, "Hi, I'm your father." And I'd never met him before, so it was a very strange moment. And I don't think I said anything. I think I was pretty overwhelmed. And he took my hand, and we walked out into this huge crowd of people screaming and shouting, and I remember the cameras were everywhere, and it was very overwhelming for a child. And I just remember looking at my dad and seeing how happy he was, but also noticing him recoil from the noise and the lights. And I think in that moment, it was a slow, gradual process over the course of my childhood of realizing, and adolescence, of realizing exactly what had happened to him and how damaged he was from it. I don't think even he realized it for a very long time. My dad is of that generation where feelings are not something you really address, I think what the beautiful thing about writing this book, actually, and this is deviating a little bit, but is that I think when he read it, when my dad finally did read it, he called me and I was petrified. He called me and he said, this is the most beautiful piece of writing I've ever read, and he was crying, and my father, I was blown away by that. And I think after he read my experience, he began to realize exactly how much his experience had affected him through, how much it affected me. And I watched him, because you can't really heal from something like that until you recognize it and address it. But in that moment, that was the first time I looked at him and thought, wow, something really terrible has happened to him. So it was a very impactful moment in my life. Go ahead.
What demands did the kidnappers make? Money, release of some other prisoners?
Yeah, it was complicated, as much of Lebanese and Middle Eastern politics are. But their original demand was they wanted some of their, fellow terrorists had been jailed in Kuwait for trying to, for terrorist plots and blowing things up and things like that, and generally just being horrible. And they wanted their release, so they thought that the U.S. could pressure the Kuwaitis to release them, which didn't happen. So that was their main goal and their main demand. But also they wanted, I believe, the release of other of their friends and cohorts who had been in Israel, held by the Israelis. And they had a lot of, and then they had the more grand overarching demands, like we want Israel out of Lebanon, we want America out of Lebanon, that kind of thing. But yeah, that pretty much covers it. Yeah. Sure.
You mentioned the physician journalists are in and out of the problem with media coverage now. There seems to be an inherent tension between the fact that the news is an entertainment industry now, and it's all about circulation and ratings. And how do you reconcile the need for reporting on important stories that make rather than the latest tweet from Donald Trump or whatever? There's an inherent problem here with how this is an entertainment industry. It has to survive.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it's very difficult in this market because you're right. What's valued in journalism right now is the the shock value or the glamour, the sexiness. It's all, I guess, because of the internet. We're very numb and sort of desensitized to so much that it has to really be different or and there's a lot of trouble in getting people interested in the kind of thing that I write because it's depressing, frankly. People don't want to read 2,000-word stories about refugees or war or things like that. It's very hard to get them to do that. I wish I had a more positive answer. It is frustrating. It's very depressing. But the best answer I can give for what I try to do is I try to build a connection between my reader and my subject, and I try really hard to paint a picture of a human being and one that my readers can relate to. Victims, villains, they're all human in the end, and I think that's a huge problem that in general in our culture and in our societies that we dehumanize, and in general in the world and humankind, is that we dehumanize people who aren't like us and we don't think of them as people. So I really try hard to make them people for my readers, and that usually for a certain type of reader that seems to make an impression, and I hope that it works. But in terms of getting people interested, getting news organizations to publish, I mean, there's like a whole song and dance routine that you have to do to even get them to consider the piece. It has to be, it's a challenge, but it's so important. It's really important that we don't lose the real news and real journalism to this kind of infotainment glamorous, and our news cycle is so hyperactive. I mean, it's just like one thing after the next. Nobody really focuses on anything. A big story is big for about 2 seconds, and then it's the next, on to the next, on to the next. So it's hard to make an impact. It's hard to feel like your work, people are even noticing it in many ways or remembering it. But all I can say is that me personally, I can't stop. I have to keep. It's a fight that I'm going to keep fighting. And I think anybody who can and has the resources and the skill set should continue to fight, because it's worth fighting for. Sure.
I'm a foreigner, and I can relate to you because us Americans, we don't realize how lucky we are with the freedom of press. I come from Argentina, where we lost the freedom of press. And by losing the freedom of press, we lost the country. So I admire you. And where can I read? Who brings you stories?
That's very sweet, thank you, and I really appreciate that. I publish with, I just had a piece actually come out today in NBC about Hezbollah. It's a multimedia piece. That's the other thing that I can, that you can do is explore new media. So people aren't really reading, so you make a video with I like to do packages, like a video story. I have videographer friends who work with me, and that helps, and then photos and things like that. But NBC, Newsweek, I publish with New York Magazine, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy. There are places doing really good stuff still. It's just it's yes, and the very bad. And I would just encourage, yes, the very bad. And it gets so tempting, and I find myself doing it too. It's not, I'm not immune to this, but the whole Donald Trump, sort of media circus that's been going on for, 2 years now? I mean, for God's sake, I can't remember the last time I went through a news day without seeing his face. It seems like forever ago. And because he's so outrageous and because he's so infuriating, it's, difficult to pull yourself away, I find. But, I encourage everybody to take a step back and maybe read about something that has nothing to do with him. Yeah. Thank you.
There's also a problem with truthfulness now in the news, and the polarization of the various media companies and how they try to depict their points of view, and they'll manipulate facts and manipulate stories. Do you want to say anything about the fact that, how does the public trust the news that they're reading?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I've I'm not, you'll get different opinions from different people. For me personally, I do write, I'm pretty opinionated, like on my Twitter feed and my social media. In life, I'm very opinionated. And I say this because, and I think journalists' opinions are important because, especially in conflict zones, we see things that other Americans don't see. We have insight that other people don't have. So I think our opinions are important. That being said, they have no place in our journalism. So when I will write opinion pieces, I'll write first-person essays, things like that. Less so now, but I used to write more. But I think it's really important to distinguish between that and just journalism, which I try to do. So in my writing, in my reporting, I actually, as good journalists should do, I fight my biases. I really try to work against them in many ways, and I try to really give a lot of respect and time to the side that I don't agree with. That I think it's important to hold up things, and I think there is balance fallacy as well. Like when Trump first started becoming a thing. There was this, huge push a lot of the times to be like, he said this and they said this and they're equal and they're on the same level. And I don't think that's necessarily, helpful either in many ways, because some things are just, they're not. Some things are just not comparable, Sometimes both sides are not, you shouldn't give both sides the same weight because they don't, some things are just common sense, However, at the same time, I think, I think the way readers, and viewers and audiences should consume the news is to consume as much variety of news as possible. So, how do you know what to trust? Well, the same story can be written different ways by different outlets. So read them all. Watch watch Fox News, for example, to see, how they're painting, this picture, and then, MSNBC, and then other things in between. And there are places, for example, how do you know what to trust? Well, this whole thing about the New York Times, this liberal bias and all that. Okay, that's fine. I haven't written for the New York Times, unfortunately. I wish, but I've written for publications, that are comparable, and I can tell you, every single thing I write is fact-checked up and down, so, and to an annoying extent sometimes. So places like that, journalists are trained to work in a way that other people aren't. So, for something to get to a publication like the New York Times, you have to trust that it has at least been vetted a lot. There's been fact checkers and editors and all these people. Now, that doesn't mean mistakes don't get made. That doesn't mean that everything that they write is the gospel truth, and you should always keep that critical eye when you read any sort of news. But my best answer to that is just read the whole spectrum. See which feels right to you. See which. And I do encourage people to read stuff that they wouldn't gravitate to, because I think that's another big problem with the internet is everybody can gravitate to the news that they agree with and that interests them, but maybe that's not necessarily the news that is going to help them grow or help our society grow. And there's that polarization has become as a result. So I encourage that. It can be quite a battle. Some of my editors barely touch my writing and are really respectful of my reporting. Others not so much. They try to put their slant on it, or they try to change things. I had actually a recent experience, and I won't say with whom, but I was writing about something, about Israel and Lebanon, and I quoted an Israeli general who said basically, in the next war with Hezbollah, we're gonna destroy Lebanon, wipe it out, and other generals have said similar things and stuff like that, and of course I had quoted many Hezbollah members who had been saying, we're gonna wipe out Israel and all this stuff. So I put the both sides in because that's my job, and the editor took out the quote from the Israeli general, just removed it. It was yes, but he took out the quote entirely, and I said, I don't understand why you would do that. And he said, oh well, they wouldn't really do that. And I was like, okay, I'm sorry, you have insight into the minds of the Israeli government now. So what I do is I fight them. I have to stick up for what I believe in and for my work. And I don't let it slide. I won't.
Keep the fight going.
Thank you. I try. Thanks. Go ahead.
I think you sound a little hard fury, so I hope I understood you. But I think you said you got a greater understanding of how a person becomes radicalized. That a lot of people in a different situation would not be radicalized. And I think you even indicated that America plays a role in that radicalization. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question. I love talking about this. I think it's really, really important to talk about because our culture, we have amnesia when it comes to our behavior in the outside world. Even our behavior, domestically, it's just, we just forget Iraq, what Iraq war, and I think what we get in America a lot of the times is this idea of ourselves as the heroes, as the white knights, as the good guys, and this is something we're raised with, we're fed, just constantly. And I'm not saying that, we don't do good things, we don't, benefit the world. Of course we do. But at the same time, for example, when you look at ISIS, there would be no ISIS if there were no invasion of Iraq. Our invasion of Iraq unleashed a whole, just an absolute just devastation and disaster in the Middle East that it will take, I don't know, decades to recover from if it ever does. And that's something we don't really acknowledge. At least I don't see a lot of acknowledgement about that. And there are other things. There are many, many decisions we have made, after our invasion of Iraq that that basically led to ISIS, becoming more and more powerful and rising. For example, this is a little example. There's a place called Camp Bucca where they would take all the people, the jihadis. This is pre-ISIS. The jihadis and the really dangerous terrorists and all these people, and they put them all in one camp together with very little supervision, and it was basically a school for terrorists. They all the most dangerous people were together, radicalized each other, radicalized people who wouldn't be radicalized, and then we let them go. And that was the beginning of ISIS. That they became the ISIS leadership. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was one of them. And in a situation like that, it's just there's no foresight, there's no long-term planning, and I think that comes with also not only the news cycle, but also our political system is election-based. So, politicians don't really think beyond the next election. It's about what can get them elected. Their policies, very few of them, are designed to ensure our long-term interests. Even they're designed to benefit us in the short term, and that's a huge problem because we don't plan. We don't see down the road. How is this going to affect our standing, our country? It just doesn't make sense. And we do a lot of really short-sighted, foolish things in the Middle East. And also, there's something that, and this is coming, in the way that we, and also the other thing is the media feeds us a lot of sensationalized, glamorized things for ratings, like about Muslims, for instance. Think about the difference between the way a mass shooting by a white person, a white American, is covered in comparison to a terror attack by a Muslim. And oftentimes, the body count is higher. It's pretty much, it's very comparable on just an objective level, but the coverage is 5 times, this is proven in studies, it's 5 times as intense for when it's a Muslim perpetrator. When there's a mass shooting by a white person, there's a lot of interest in their psychological state, in what led them to be radicalized, what led them to where they are. There is none of that curiosity or interest when the perpetrator is Muslim. There's none. It's just very surface. It's very shallow. They're monsters. They're terrorists. They hate us for our freedom, which may be true on some level, but at the same time, they also hate us because they're people in Iraq. Imagine if you're a poor villager in Iraq, no education, no real outside experience, nothing like that. Poor, uneducated, and a U.S. airstrike takes out your whole family. And there have been, by the way, since Trump took office, the civilian casualties in Iraq and Syria have skyrocketed. There's thousands more than there were under Obama. And that's a very short-sighted approach to defeating terrorism when you kill maybe a terrorist and take out a village or a dozen civilians. Well, those civilians have family members, they have friends, they have kids, orphans now, and now they hate America. So there's many ways that we contribute to this cycle, and I think it's something we should at least acknowledge and try to prevent. Yeah. Did you have a question, Nick?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I have the opinion that with all of the very extreme opinions mostly on the internet, some on television, on both right and left, that an American reader can get a really good picture of the news. There are three organizations. There's Reuters, there's the Associated Press, which I hope you agree with me are straight.
Yes. Yes, they do good work. Yes. Excellent.
And then read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which have their little positions, but you still get a darn good balance, particularly if you read them both.
Yes.
And so I'm just saying, I don't think American journalism is falling apart. I think it's still actually, I'd like that. I mean, name me a country that has better access to straight information.
England.
England would say no.
Really? I think they do excellent. I mean, I think some of their stuff is really good. They get paid. I mean, also they have more money to pay their journalists as well because it's publicly funded.
Well, I mean, if you're including Reuters, I might go along with it. But Reuters is the equivalent of the Antarctica.
It's funny because my dad and I have the same argument. And I have to say, I totally agree with you that there are organizations that still do excellent journalism. But remember, in your day, there were, the Chicago Tribune had foreign bureaus, right? The smaller publications had, the
Los Angeles Post and Chicago Tribune, lots of Baltimore Sun, they all have art.
right. Well, where did they go? They're gone now.
No, they have you.
Now they report. Well, I can only do so much. Now they report from, they report from America, or they outsource. They use, so I'm saying the variety, the. Yeah, I'm not saying that it's completely dead, but it's terminal illness, I think, and unless something is done to change that, it's going to get worse. As someone who lives it, who has watched the industry in this time, yeah. Anybody else? Okay, all right. Thank you so much.